Welcome to what is this? Our fourth session of Genesis for Normal People. Wow, it's already the fourth session. This is going by quite fast. So in this session, we're covering chapters 6 through 7, which takes us through the flood right up to dead Tower of Babel. So let's just jump right into this. I'll get my questions up for chapter 6. What did you all think about chapter 6 before we get into these questions?
Well, yes, in a way, it sort of covers familiar stuff, the flood, and then I guess Noah's son, but and it moves on to the Tower of Babel, right? So I guess it's pretty, general in what you've heard, but the way they want us to look at it can be kind of complicated, far out there in a way.
Yeah. I've noticed just reading the first couple of chapters, bringing us up to where we're at now, when they've said, oh, look at it this way, the first time they said it, it was like an entirely new revelation of like, oh, look at the creation story. It's referring to all of Israel. And then once you saw that, you're kind of trained to think, okay, I bet a similar theme is in the next chapter. Oh, wait, it is. So, at least for me, it stops being like as shocking of a revelation as it was at first.
I think that one of the things I have to say that reading it, I didn't read last week. I'm going to put that on video. I know y'all are recording it, but I didn't read last week because I got back from vacation and just didn't find time to do so. But this week I read and I really found myself wanting to look at other sources and other books to see, because I guess my perspective on any kind of study like this is it's still just one person's perspective, one person's viewpoint, and there's other scholars I've studied and have different viewpoints. So, guys, I have a library that has books in it. And so I used my New Interpreter's Bible commentary in 12 volumes to just see what they had to say in these same areas. Because some of these things, you read this book, the Bible, that book, so many different times, and, you understand it in different ways depending on who's leading and who's teaching and stuff. So I just found it interesting to look at these, actually comparing two different viewpoints of the book that we're reading, and then using the commentary that's got multiple people that write things on the different sections and stuff, different scholars that are way more scholarly than me. So my only thing is, it's just like, oh, it makes me question and want to ask more questions, I guess, is what this book does for me.
Yeah. Is there anything in particular that you found helpful from that commentary?
Just it's obviously more scholarly talk because it's not written for normal people. So I really shouldn't be reading it because I'm not really that scholarly. But it does. I can't really pick out one thing, but it really does help explain. I guess this book is many pages to break down. There's like 2 pages to break down Genesis 6, 1-4, where here it's using, like 12 pages to break down Genesis 6 through chapter 6 through chapter 9, where this is chapter 6 verses 1-4. So this has a lot more pages and a lot more talking help explain. So I think the Genesis for Normal People book does a good job to give you the abbreviated version, but sometimes I think it's helpful to have the more in-depth detail to help explain, that this is good place to start, and it is good for normal people if you just want an overview. But when it's like, well, wait a second, that's not how I understood it. Let me read what somebody else says, and then you can have another understanding of it. So
yeah, definitely. When I'm starting to study a topic, I find it helpful to have like a general bird's eye view like this book gives, and then narrow down, because I've sometimes studied topics with a narrowed down view first, and I'm like, what are they even talking about? I was reading a book on just a history book that I didn't have any context to put that information, and I never ended up finishing it because I'm like, okay, this is way too foreign for me. And then I read Wikipedia, and I'm like, the book's making sense now. I can go back to it. So let's just jump right into the questions. The first question is, what are the implications of reading the flood as universal or regional?
Well, if you read it regional, where the ancients lived, they thought the world was flat, so they really didn't have really a concept of universal, I don't think. They just looked around and figured out what's happening around them,
Yeah.
Yeah, what's happening around them happen everywhere.
Right. If it's raining here, it's raining everywhere. If it's flooding here, it's flooding everywhere, yeah. But then on the other hand, it's like if they ventured out to other areas, if the flood happened and where they went to other areas, they would see that it flooded everywhere too. So it's kind of, I guess they could see that it was universal because they went out, but then on the other hand, it's kind of regional because they only could go out so far, and they thought the world was flat and they were going to go off the edge. So I don't know. It seems kind of almost the same exact thing. Their universe is their region.
I like that. Their universe is like the 200 square miles that they live in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't see to you guys in North Carolina. So without the internet, without modern communication, I wouldn't know you guys existed, and you wouldn't know that I existed, because two completely different areas. And I like how they mentioned that the major concern of the flood account is not how it happened or where it happened, but why. Cool. Does anyone else have anything on that first question before we jump to the next? All right. What are the major themes of the flood story as you read it? Is it helpful or unhelpful to teach it to children at such a young age? Why or why not?
Well, I guess when we was taught the flood story, we didn't think, because it says in the note, that it could teach the children, God's violence and other issues, but we never looked at it as God being violent towards the people, which in, I guess, a way, maybe he was, but you know, it's sort of like today. He almost needs to send flood or something out to come and straighten out some things. So
Amen.
we didn't never look at it as God being violent or hateful, or so I think yes, the children should definitely be taught just like we were, you know, the different stories in the Bible, because why not? Why not? It ain't hurt us so far, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think the only challenge with it is with anything you have to be cautious that you want to give to him. I know we all believe in God and he's there, and you know, but what if I make him mad and he's going to wipe me out, you know, that he doesn't, he sees something I do as evil. So, I mean, it's almost like parents can use it as a weapon against kids. And I think they do. You know, we always say, God's watching you, you know, do what you want, but God's watching. And so it's almost like you're making God out to be the bad guy, or, you know, really not, because you're trying to teach them to do good. But, so I think that there's differences. I don't think you should keep the story from them. But I also think we have to recognize how we present it to them and how they see it. Because, you know, like my nephew's a little off anyway, so I'll just put that out there. But my nephew, when he was younger, probably 8 or 10, they went to the Catholic Church at the time and went to see the Stations of the Cross. And, you know, that's a violent story too. And so he actually, like, when he heard that they nailed him to the cross, he passed out. So, you know, so I think that you have to recognize the stories that we do tell people and kids especially, and how we tell them, recognize how they might receive it as well. That I don't think we want them to be afraid of God. You know, I don't think, like I think we talked about that last week, you know, the fear of God was more of being in awe of God or recognizing God's greatness, not necessarily truly fear as we understand it today. And I think that's my caution, is we don't want kids to fear God. We want them to be in awe of God.
Well, it makes me think too of, you know, that little cartoon series VeggieTales, and it's like they present it in a way that's friendly and it's, you know, cartoonish, but yet it tells the story and gets kids familiar with different parts of the Bible and these different tales. And so I think that's a good way of putting it, that you have to be careful
Absolutely.
with, I guess, how it's presented, but yet it's still the story. So
yeah, absolutely. You don't want to change the story, but you want to make sure. So I love VeggieTales, so we're good.
yeah.
Me too. I think an important aspect of really teaching children the Bible in general is, like, it's fine to teach children that simplified version of these stories, and some of these stories I'm just flat out not gonna teach children. I'm not gonna do Judges 19, which is my favorite passage to bring up to score people. Judges 19 is the Levite and the prostitute, where a prostitute gets chopped up into 12 pieces and sent to all 12 of Israel. Which, when you tell that to people, they're like, that's in the Bible? And I'm like, yep. So some passages, I don't know how I would teach that or how I would preach on that. Pastor Mike's lucky I did not choose that for my sermon this week. I should have, but I didn't.
But I think you should have went for it.
Pastor Mike, I think he should do children's time.
That's fine. It still might be a fun challenge. Maybe I'll challenge myself and do that the last week before y'all leave. I'll use that one just to show that it can be.
Okay, but yeah, I think the most important thing, and maybe I'll have to ask for another sermon so I can preach that. I think the most important thing is knowing, like, when you can teach a more nuanced version, because I've noticed within the church, people learn these stories as children and never challenge the assumptions that they've learned as children. So they're always like, the understanding of the flood story is the understanding they had at 4 or 5 years old, because they never bothered to explore it more on their own. Plus, one other thought I had is, we do this simplistic understanding and then more complex understanding in all sorts of subjects. I took history in middle school, and I took the same exact history in high school, but the high school US history I took was a lot more nuanced than my middle school US history, because I could understand more of what was actually going on. So, yeah. Let's move on to the third question. As you were introduced to stories like Ultrahasis and Gilgamesh, what were your reactions to these stories and the similarities with the stories in Genesis?
Catherine, you wrote that down for us. What'd we say?
Oh, we talked about it last night. I'll tell you. But I don't remember, you know.
Well, that was one of the questions we really.
Yeah, we didn't know. We kind of went on question 4. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't put much for that question either.
I think one of the questions, I think what it's trying to get to is just, does it change how you look at the story? Does it change your understanding of God's work? And, you know, I think for me, that because, you know, a lot of people say that a lot of the stories that are in Bible are, you know, similar to stories that are in other teachings and other writings from ancient times. And, you know, I think the question is that change how we understand who God is? That, you know, a lot of these stories are stories written down, and I think that's what they were trying to get at, that these are stories that are written down, how people explain away how events and stories happen and their understanding of God. So I think that really, you know, having the different versions, but yet they're all from about the same time, shows that there was a flood event. You know, it shows that there definitely was a flood. So I think it confirms for me that the flood was real. Now the question is, that doesn't answer is, you know, those are still all in the same general area. So, you know, how far did the flood reach? Was it really the whole earth, or was it just the earth as they understood it? You know, we won't ever know that, you know, but I think science has shown that there has been major flood over time in history, that, you know, science has proven that. So I think that the struggle is to change how we understand God. If there's different faith practices out there that understand God and or they're small g gods that, you know, that had multiple gods, and that flood story, does that change how we understand God? And I don't think it does. I think it just means that we know that our God is the one that got it right, and we understand, you know, God's hand in doing it and providing good from it. That, you know, that God say everybody's really sinful and we're going to wipe away, and it started raining and started flooding, and Noah was smart enough to build an ark, and somebody gave him, you know, and said, hey, you need enough to do it, and now creation is coming from him, and you know, like the new Adam as it compares him to. So I think that helps strengthen my faith in God, rather than diminish it in any way, because there was a flood, that the ancestors understood it.
Yeah. And to add on that was great. And I think the power actually comes in the differences between the two. Like, I forget, was it Ultrahasis or Gilgamesh? It was Ultrahasis that basically the flood was caused because the humans were being too noisy, and God got annoyed with them. Where even with the Tower of Babel, we can see that God is the one who comes down to earth, like Yahweh, the God of Israel, isn't one that just gets annoyed with his creation. So it's like, this is how everyone else thought about God. And sure, the Israelites are going to have some similarities because that's their context. But these differences are really stark differences. And I think we kind of addressed how, like, the flood story and destroying creation of the fact that the Bible was more concerned with why it happened, not how it happened. And I think modern science kind of adds to it, like, how. Does anyone have anything to add on that fourth question? I didn't read it because I think we kind of already discussed it.
I think it brings a challenge that, I think the question is, basically, does God cause natural disasters to punish his people? And I know people that believe very much so that, Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, 10, 15 years ago, I don't know, 10 years ago? I don't know how long ago it was, wiped out a whole lot of southern, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and Alabama, and all the casinos and everything. So I had family members that said, oh, it's because, of all the sin in that area, and that they were wiping the sin off the face of the earth, and, making them repent for their sin and stuff. And, if that's the case, every person that has some sort of disaster happen to them is because God's smiting them. And I guess in my first church that I pastored in Cedarville, Ohio, one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, Herman and Treva, I love them. They had a daughter, and at the time she was in her 50s, early 50s, and came down with cancer and died pretty suddenly. And he basically said, Herman said to me, this shame for the sins of the way she lived her life. And that just, it killed me. That God that he would think that God would give her cancer to punish her for things she did earlier in her life. And to me, that's not how I understand, how would a God that gave his only son still show anger towards us and give us disease and hurricanes and all those things? And so for me, I think it challenges my understanding of God. I guess post-Christ God, before that, it seems like people's relationship was different than after a savior was actually sent to take the sin away from the world. And so for me, I think it's harmful if people view and only view the natural disasters are God's wrath, because I don't think that's what the Bible is trying to tell us at all. So, I'm concerned that some people still view the natural disasters and things that happen to people as God's judgment against them. I have a hard time saying, like the tsunami that wiped away hundreds of thousands of people. I think that's referenced in the book. I don't see that as being God's wrath either. So,
plus that little verse of, and God put a rainbow in the sky, and I like how this book explained it as, like, a bow is a weapon of war, and by putting a rainbow in the sky. God was putting his bow in the sky for all to see, saying, I will never again take my bow and use it as a weapon of destruction. So anyone who says, oh, this is because of sin, it's like, they must have not read Genesis, because in Genesis it says that God will never do that again. Like, and what really gets me is God did, Genesis says that God did this to kind of as a reset of society, because things were getting so bad. And the funny part is that reset didn't work. Like, if it would have worked, we would not have the rest of the Bible, because we wouldn't have to have a problem with all of it. But the fact that we do have the rest of the Bible shows that simply starting over doesn't work. It can't. So, any last thoughts on the flood account?
Well, I think I agree a lot with what Mike said. We always, have heard, do not fear, his plans are for you to prosper and whatnot. So I don't think that, he would throw wrath or something your way. I don't think he would. So I think it's a lot like what Mike said, I think he's there to do a lot of good. He's not there to, push you out in front of a bus and kill you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think those understandings of quote unquote false interpretations of God come from either not understanding the Bible, or a like negative experience that they're projecting on God. Because we always try to search for meaning in this world, search for why does this happen? And it's almost easy to blame God for like someone dying in our lives, or us not getting the promotion at work or whatever. It's easier to blame God rather than say this is a fact of human life and life will go on. Plus, with the New Testament's understanding that with Jesus, this life isn't the end. And even that is somewhat interesting, because that like resurrection theology was actually in Judaism before the time of Jesus, and it sprouted up during the time of persecution, where the Israelites were questioning, now that our temple is destroyed and we're under captivity, and it seems like God's not in control, what's next? So this theology of this life isn't the end kind of developed. getting on a soapbox right there, but that's all right. Cool. Let's move on to chapter 7, the Tower of Babel. And yeah, long genealogy and the Tower of Babel. It says, how would you explain how the many languages in Genesis 10 and one language in Genesis 11? What do you think is the author's point of view in putting those stories back to back?
I don't really know why he would sort of bring up many languages and then go back to maybe a one language. I don't know.
The way that my interpreter's Bible talked about was that, you know, again, looking at the regional versus universal, just that, you know, in that one area, they had one language. You know, this is Babylon. This is, so they all spoke the same language. So it doesn't necessarily mean everybody on earth spoke the same language, but everybody in that region spoke the same language. And it said a couple other things. I just don't remember what all else it said. But so I think that's one way to look at it. It's just that it's more within that region. You know, they're making it sound like a universal story, but and we've always taught it as a universal story that all people in the world spoke one language, but yet we know that that wasn't true. So I really think it's the way people look at their situation. And it also talked about the fact that this is where is it? We're in chapter 11. Let me turn there. Because it also talked about it talks. This is one where it gives me like 4 big bullet points about that one section. Where in the book we don't get 4 bullet points about that one section. So it's really speaking of the story has a universal whole earth perspective. Speaking of what is true of humankind generally, yet the function of universalism in context where historically identifiable people are very much in view. It speaks of Babel, makes somewhat different from other primeval narratives. Let's see, I'm just speaking all this big word stuff. People of the world could be multiplied, and definitely in other words. What is described here characterizes the peoples mentioned in the previous chapter. It's just that one's referring to the fact that it's looking at one people, but then the other one talks about how it's a story that can, on one hand, talk about the differences between unifying, because we want unity in thought and unity, and the Bible's trying to bring us together to be one body, but then being too much of one body, one mind, and we're thinking on human terms instead of godly terms, then having separation might be good because we're trying to come together to do something that only God could do, kind of thing. So it's kind of saying that there's that in between yes, we want to be united, but also we don't want to be so united that we're turning against God, kind of thing. So
yeah,
in normal language.
And it's interesting almost how easily we read throughout the Bible how the Israelites are wooed by other people to worship their foreign gods. And if sticking with the themes that they presented and looking at this Tower of Babel story as a mini Israel, it's kind of showing that putting Israel with other people, they'll abandon what they know to be true about the God of Israel and worship the way that the Babylonians do. At least I need to study all this stuff a lot more, but at least that's, yeah. There's so much in Genesis.
There is. I mean, I love the book of Genesis. There is so much richness in Genesis and the explanation of who God is and how God is and why God is and all those things. I think that one of the things I found was interesting in this New Interpreter's Bible commentary as well is the third bullet point. Basically, it talks about so often in unity we forget to look at the bigger picture, and I think that's a lot of it too, that it's like trying to do things unto ourselves. So even in, like, it compares to the church today, that we basically so often are isolated in our church. Our church basically is its own little bubble, and we do our own things, and we minister to each other and with each other, but we forget to look at the world outside of us as well. And so it talks about the command of Matthew 28:18-20 calls for the church to scatter across the face of the earth. But so often our churches refuse that call, and we really are focused on what are we doing for us, what are we doing to study the Bible, what are we doing to live out our faith, but we're not really leaving the walls of our church to share our faith outside with others and bring us to understand who God is and God's grace as well. We talk about it and we mine money to missionaries that are outside the wall, but we really go outside the walls to do it. So it's almost the same kind of mindset of with the Tower of Babel. They were trying to do their own thing, but not necessarily looking at God's greater picture of what God really wants for his people.
Yeah. That's good. I guess I'll move on to the second one. According to the Tower of Babel, God comes down while the Babylonians are attempting to go up and reach the gods. As we think about the Bible as a whole, especially Jesus in the New Testament, what are the implications for having a God who comes down?
I feel like they were trying to go up, like they were disconnected from God. So they were trying to, so they could reach the heavens and to kind of see what God's like, what heaven is like, see what the normal earthly people can't. And so I think that's saying, well, God comes down. So we know God is around us, it's with us. So there's no need in trying to build this tower or to try to be more than what you're supposed to be for you to know God or to understand what heaven is like. Or so I think that's kind of what it's saying is God's here and God's with us. And
I'm gonna date myself. That it reminds me of the song Belinda Carlisle sang a long time ago, "Heaven is a Place on Earth." I think that's look it up. It's a good song. But
what was his name again?
I love you, Richie. Her name, never mind. But honestly, I think that's the greatest thing is, I think from God coming down at the time of the Tower of Babel to check on things, and then also, through the incarnation of Jesus. I mean, really what it is, it's God wants to be present with us and wants us to know that God is present with us and relatable and attainable. That even though, you're not supposed to see the face of God, God is still making sure that we know that God's here, God is with us. And kind of like Jesus take the wheel. I think that there's times that we just need to be reminded, pandemic, that God is with us. And so that's what it says to me, is that God is with us, that he's approachable.
Yeah. Remembrance you're taking from my sermon this week.
Uh-oh.
Cool. And then there's the last one. According to Joshua 24:2, Terah, Abraham's father, worshipped other gods in Babylon. This text is silent, but do you think Abraham would have gone along with that? Does this affect your view of Abraham? Why or why not?
What do you think, Noah?
Um, so I turn back to Genesis 12, where Abraham was called. And basically, the text says, Abraham, or God called Abram, and Abram went. I found that interesting because, like, if you turn to the New Testament, Saul has this big, like, conversion experience on the road to Damascus. But with Abraham, God's like, it's more like Jesus calling one of his disciples, come follow me. And they went, there's nothing like cataclysmic about it, nothing life-changing. What he did after was life-changing, but the call itself wasn't that remarkable, at least how I read it. So I think Abraham probably did worship the Babylonian gods, because it was all he knew. Like, even with me, I've had thoughts of like, okay, why am I a Christian? I know God's done amazing things in my life, and I believe that God's like changed me. I've had a real experience with God. But another big part of why I'm a Christian is I was born in the United States in a family that went to church, that was open to God, and that was a natural progression for me. But if I was born into a family of another religion, if I was honest with myself, I probably would follow that religion until I found something that I didn't like about it, or just something in my spirit said, like, this is not the way. And at least when everyone, in the case of Abraham, when every single person is worshiping these Babylonian gods, you betcha you'd probably do it also. And especially back in the ancient Near East, there would be a god for everything. And agriculture was a huge thing. So if you want your crops to grow, you better worship the sun god and the god of agriculture, because if your crops don't grow, you lose your livelihood. So I think he probably did. But this doesn't really affect my view of Abraham, because, at least for me, what matters is, what did he do after he got the call? For us as Christians, even, we're called not to judge people period. But it's unfair to judge people for their previous life before they knew God, because really they probably didn't know any better.
Well, and in a way, I think it makes them stronger, if they went through whatever prior to their calling, then they've got, a story prior to becoming a Christian. So I think it makes them appreciate, their faith that much more.
Exactly. I've heard something that you as a Christian, you have like the most power for Christian witness within the first 2 years of getting saved. Of like when you are on fire for God, you know how much God's changed your life. And then we tend to get set in our ways. It's not that we won't do Christian witness like the Great Commission calls us, but it's just that we allow like what we have to do, all the cares of life to creep in on that.
Well, and that's kind of true. That's right.
Yeah. And just know whatever I'm saying is also convicting me as much as it's may convict you all. But Pastor Mike, I know you just have something burning on your tongue.
Can you see it? Sorry. I just think that there again, I think that you've said it all really well. That basically, yeah, that's the way he was brought up. I mean, what you're brought up with is what you know until God reveals God's self to you in a different way. And so, if you know Hinduism, that's what you know until God opens your heart in a different way. If you know Islam, that's what you know until God opens your way in a different heart, in a different way. So I think that's it. That obviously, if his father followed other gods in Babylon and stuff, but yet when the God of Israel called him and said, "Hey, get up and follow me," he did. So obviously God convicted his heart in some way, and I think that's when it's like you said, that that salvation moment, that aha moment, that that you're God's child, is something that will move you and motivate you, and you'll do some amazing things because of it. And I think that's kind of what this speaks to, is that somehow God got Abram's attention, and we're here today because of it. So
Cool. And I think that's an awesome way to end off our discussion on chapters 6 through 7. For next week, we will read chapters 8 through 9. I realized I kind of got it a little bit messed up on my reading schedule. I said 9 through 10, and then I realized I left out chapters 8. So next week we'll read chapters 8 through 9, and then the following week we'll read chapters so let's see. Next week we will read chapters 8 through 9, and then the following week we will read chapters 10, 11, and the conclusion. So all you have to worry about is 8 through 9 for next week. Sounds good?
Good.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you for joining. That concludes our study on these chapters.